We the people, we the people, we the people, we the people.
United States of America.
I spent 8 years in the Rhode Island House back in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was really mind-boggling the way things worked up there. When I first got there in 1987, I discovered that the members, most of them, were so beholden to the leadership, they would do whatever the leaders want them. And they knew that any bill that came to the floor was there only because the leadership had approved it, and so it was supposed to pass. So what they actually did was push in their green voting button and lock it in with a piece of cardboard. Then whatever came up, they were recorded as voting aye, aye, aye. And it was mind-boggling. They didn't have to be in their seats, they didn't have to be in the chamber, and they certainly didn't have to pay any attention to the debate. And some pretty bad bills passed this way. Now, the cardboard voting, as I call it, actually ended in 1988 when the electronics was changed. But that didn't matter much because they would still just push that green button. I say you could train a pigeon or a chicken to do that. They weren't paying any attention. I'll give you some examples of some of the stupid bills that passed. Most of them sort of harmless and somewhat comical, some of them very damaging. The first one that comes to mind was a bill to get tough on illegal drugs. And the sponsor of the bill was including in there putting people in prison for 10 years for possession of cocoa leaves, because he thought that cocaine came from cocoa leaves. It comes from a totally different plant, the coca plant, but he didn't know that, and it passed easily. Later it was fixed. They love to have tough on crime records to take to their constituents. So another gimmick was to have mandatory minimum sentences for various drug offenses, and they kept inventing new ones. Anybody that wanted something else to put in his brochure came forward with a new idea. We'll double the sentences if you are found with a drug within so many 1,000 feet of a school or something of that sort. And I remember on one day I offered an amendment. I said, instead of multiplying the sentence by 2, why don't we multiply it by pi? And the speaker declared that that was frivolous and absurd, and they didn't do that. But they didn't think it was frivolous and absurd to multiply a 50-year sentence by 2. That passed easily enough. And more recently, and the present time, 07, 08, some legislators see the damage in these minimum sentences, mandatory minimums. First of all, you're wasting somebody's life there, but more important to us, it's costing the taxpayers money to keep people in prison year after year. So they passed a bill last year to eliminate these mandatory minimums or cut them way down. Too bad, the governor vetoed it. So it's still there. And my thesis is that when you pass a bad law, it's very hard to fix it. And there's been plenty of bad laws. One of them that really hurt the state of Rhode Island came along in 1988 regarding credit unions. It was going to increase the liquidity reserve requirements, we were told, the amount of liquid assets the credit unions have to hold back in case people come in and want to make a withdrawal. And I looked at the bill. It was only a page and a half long, and it wasn't going to increase them. It was going to eliminate them. And we had a long debate. A long debate meant 4 minutes. And a couple of people backed me up, and we had a close vote. I think it was about 48 to 32 passing the bill. That was considered a close vote in those days. Most things were unanimous. But it passed, sailed through the Senate, became law, and it was one of the causes of the collapse of the credit unions a couple of years later. That was the one that really hurt. And if you didn't get hurt directly by your own money being tied up, your business being handicapped, look what happened to the sales tax. It went up from 6 to 7% in order to pay off the people who'd lost their money or whose money was tied up. And of course, it's never gone back down from 7%. And over the years, it's cost taxpayers $1.5 billion. That's $1,500 per man, woman, and child in the state of Rhode Island. Of course, they're using the money for other things now, but that was the motivation. That was the excuse for raising the sales tax. Another wonderful bill that passed in the about 93, I forget exactly, outlawed certain weapons. Outlawed blackjacks and brass knuckles and slingshots and various things. And then in the next paragraph, it said, you mustn't sell these to a child unless he brings a note from his mother, a note from his parent. And I said, what sense does this make? Oh, it's a good bill. They passed it, and it's still on the books. People have tried to get it fixed year after year since then. It's still on the books, how many years? 15, 17 years later. Another one that's comical, and it could cause problems, actually, had to do with the public financing. We've got laws that provide that candidates for general office, by that I mean governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, treasurer, attorney general, if they agree to certain limits on campaign spending, they can get some support, some public funds. Well, what happens if they have a primary contest? Well, the law says that if you have a primary contest and you're in the public funding program, you can spend more money during the primary, provided you don't spend more money than the sum of what your opponents spend. I said, excuse me, how do you know what your opponents are spending? I have a hard time knowing what I'm spending until after the fact. And furthermore, you can't spend more than the sum of your opponents. If two of your opponents spend $1,000 each, can I spend $2,000? And then can they look back and say, we can spend $3,000? It made absolutely no sense, and it's still on the books. They don't realize it doesn't make sense because there's really very little thinking and very little reading of the bills that goes on. Whatever comes to the floor is supposed to pass because it's been approved by the leadership. Now, this brings up a question, too, though, because amendments can be offered. And what happens if people are automatically pushing the green button or they've got it locked in with cardboard? What happens if a hostile amendment is introduced and you're not supposed to vote for it, you're supposed to vote against it? Oh, they had that problem solved. In that case, one of the leaders would stand up and say, I move to table the amendment. And what that does is reverse the meaning of yes and no, ends debate, and the green button is still the way to kill it. So one day, I think the devil made me do it. There was a bill to ban out-of-state garbage coming to the Johnston landfill. And somebody in the leadership offered an amendment to delay the effectiveness till January of the following year. And I couldn't stand it. I stood up and said, I move to table. And somebody else moved to second my motion, and then they were stuck. You can't debate a motion to table. And they had all their stupid buttons locked in, and momentarily my motion to table passed. And then the majority leader gets up and he says, oh, Rodney fooled us. We've got to do that vote over again. So it was a short-lived victory. But, you know, it has not changed. In about 91, I was fussing about the rules. I thought the problem was with the rules. I thought it was bad that we were getting bills hot off the copy machine, no time to read them, and they were sailing through without anybody trying to pay attention. So they humored me. They passed a rule that said we're going to get the bills before we vote on them, day before, and we'll limit the number of bills to 40 per day. Well, a little progress. But it wasn't really progress because as soon as it got into June or July and they wanted to quit, they suspended the rules. And we went back to the old way. Today, there isn't even a make-believe rule. They don't have to suspend it because it doesn't exist anymore. In fact, in this session, 2008, in June, in about 3 days, they passed 360 bills and 30 amendments, and practically nobody knew what was going on. They just vote yes, push that green button. And they're happy. They don't care. They want to go home. They want to go campaign. I don't think that's a good way to represent us. And I was the troublemaker there, I guess, when I was there. I was the guy that would object to this. Not that my objections carried much weight. But if I go back, I'll be the objector again. And I think that's my main concern, is to have the General Assembly start acting responsibly, start being a so-called deliberative body instead of a bunch of sheep. And I've got a TV spot that represents the legislature as a bunch of sheep. Thank you for the opportunity to get this off my chest.
This concludes this program broadcast. We the People, a freedom of speech television show. Go to www.wethepeopleofri.org.